well, I think it will be time for us to begin. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this seminar organized by the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at GW and our Liberalism study program. We are here to discuss Glenn Deason's latest book, Russian Conservatism, Managing Change Under Permanent Revolution, that was very recently published. And we have been here at the Institute having several sessions discussing all the recent books published on Russian conservatism. And I think it's really showing how much research on Russia is now kind of taking into consideration a kind of much deeper, long-term history, looking at 19th century Russia, Soviet time, and the 30 years of independence or post-Soviet period we have, to try to make sense of the cultural and the political, the ideological transformation of Russia. And Glenn's book is really part of that great, I think, discussion that is happening now around trying to understand what means conservatism for Russia. So let me say a few words about Glenn and our two great discussants. Glenn Deason is professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and is an editor of the Russia in Global Affairs journal. He has been working on geo-economic and conservative philosophies of Russia's Greater Eurasia initiatives. He has another book called Europe at the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia, Geo-economic Regions in a Multipolar World, and this recently just published book on Russian conservatism that we will be discussing today, and several other books previously published. And then we are very happy to receive as discussant Andrei Kortunov, who is the director of the Russian International Affairs Council and is on the board of several Russian and international expert organizations looking at international relations and Russian foreign policy. And then we will have Paul Robinson, professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, who has published several works on Russian and Soviet history, including a book also on Russian conservatism that we discussed last fall, and who is now writing a book on the history of Russian liberalism. So really a great combination of scholars and experts to discuss Glenn's book. So what I propose we will be doing is that, Glenn, I give you the floor for about 20 minutes to present your book, and then I will be giving the floor to Andrei and Paul for like 10 minutes each discussion, and then we will open the floor for the Q&A. I invite all the people in the audience to ask questions in the chat, and I will be moderating the Q&A session when we will be there. So once again, welcome everybody, and Glenn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just have some slides prepared. Can you see this now?
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. My name is Glenn Deason. I'm a professor at the University of Southeast Norway. And I would also like to thank Marlene Laruelle for organizing and moderating this, as well as Andrei Kortunov and Paul Robinson for volunteering as discussants. I'm a big fan of the work of all three of you. So yes, it's a great privilege. The title of the book is Russian Conservatism, Managing Change Under Permanent Revolution. And the title intends to summarize the main thesis of the book, which is that Russia's principal challenge throughout its history has been this struggle to establish an organic development, or evolutionary change, if you want, based on its particular history, culture, and geography. Now, the consequence of this failure has been a history of revolutionary change, which is a disruptive approach to change by uprooting the former order and purging one's own past in order to give way to something entirely new. Now, revolutionary change is the antithesis of conservatism, as conservatives aim to manage change by ensuring that the new builds on the old, thus bridging the past with the present. Now, in the pursuit of stable and gradual and organic development, I therefore argue that Russian conservatism naturally leans more and more towards Eurasianism for two reasons. That is, first, to connect Russia's fragmented history, but also second, with the rise of Asia now, it offers Russia what it didn't have in the past, which is a path to organic development, as its Eurasian geography becomes an asset rather than a burden. So this is what I will discuss today. So I argue that the conservative appeal for Russia is to tame this revolutionary history and impulses it's had. So they say that conservatism usually begins with a loss, because by experiencing loss, there's a recognition for the need to conserve, so functioning more or less as a mechanism. But and Russia has really lost a lot throughout its 1,000-year history, which is why it's also fragmented into this different and contradictory period. Now, this detachment from its own past is a key impulse for conservatism. So I wanted to start with this quote by an excellent Russian conservative, Nikolai Berdyaev, who very correctly referred to Russia's development as nothing short of catastrophic. Now, he wrote that interruption is characteristic of Russian history, and contrary to the opinion of Slavophiles, the last thing it is organic. So there's been 5 periods in Russian history, and each provides a different picture. They are the Russia of Kiev, Russia in the days of the Tatar yoke, Russia of Moscow, Russia of Peter the Great, and Soviet Russia. And it's quite possible that there will be yet another Russia, in which he, of course, was correct. But Berdyaev defined this fragmented development as catastrophic because it disconnected Russia from its own past and fragmented the history to the point that it fuels a lot of divisions and pulling Russia in different directions at the same time. Now, one can argue that the reason behind, or the source behind, this fragmented history and unique strands of conservatism has been the so-called Eurasian schism, or split, as Russian civilization originated in Kievan Rus, more or less as a normal European maritime nation. However, then the fragmentation of Kievan Rus and invasion by the Mongols in the 13th century became a form of revolutionary change by destroying the key institutions and also severing Russia's economic connectivity with other Europeans. However, the Mongols were not hostile to the Orthodox Church, which is, of course, why it has become an even more central component in Russia's cultural attachment to its past, and indeed the only conservative variable really to survive the 1,000 years. Now, after shedding the Tatar yoke, the Muscovite Russia still cemented its Eastern character, and that's when you had this first expression of this dualism or contradiction, as Russia remained an Eastern power, or even Eurasian, although at the same time, it could be considered to be more European than Europe, as its exile from the continent had allowed it to preserve certain traditions and religious practices. So again, falling in this spectrum from being not European to being the real Europe, and that's kind of why the discourse become more complex. Now, the next revolutionary period for Russia was there of Peter the Great, which contributed by reconnecting Russia with European maritime trade corridors. Now, in the early 18th century, Peter defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War, thus returning Russia to Europe, making Russia a maritime power, a great power, and officially an empire. Peter the Great also established a modernized commerce, factories, school, academia, ports, fleet, and, well, everyone could agree it was good for Russia, the modernization. However, the modernization also entailed a cultural revolution to remake Russia as a European state. Now, the aim was therefore to some extent set the clock back by purging the Mongol and the Muscovite past. So in other words, the Enlightenment manifested itself to some extent as the Europeanization of Russia. And the need to balance modernity and tradition thus expressed itself to some extent geographically as a Western versus Eastern identity. And conservatives in Russia therefore focused much on the need to stop obsessing about the West. Now, Russian conservatives have often therefore been misunderstood as being anti-Western. However, I would argue that this is wrong, as most Russian conservatives at the time expressed great admiration for the achievement of the West, but simply rejected based on the concept of organic change that Russia could not prosper if it merely became an artificial replica of the West. And also the concept of rationality didn't really support the idea that it should purge its own culture. About political conservatism then began to develop in the 19th century. So like Western conservative, Russia was profoundly influenced by the French Revolution, and in response to it, we've seen the emergence of conservative Slavophiles, especially in the 1820s and 30s, which were also deeply hostile towards the Cultural Revolution of Peter the Great a century before. However, later conservatives began to change because they recognized a paradox, as the conservative Slavophiles themselves had a revolutionary element to them, because the Slavophiles, they also to some extent wanted to purge their own history. So purge the history of Peter the Great, much like Peter the Great had attempted to purge the Muscovite Russia. So this was problematic because nostalgia should not be confused with conservatism, and this again created some internal contradictions. Now, into the 19th century, though, we saw conservatives began to challenge the Slavophiles more openly, as the argument then, for example, Dostoevsky was one of them, arguing that a truly unified Russia based on organic growth really had to accommodate both its Western and its Eastern periods. So this became more and more defining conservatives. But then yet again, another revolutionary moment became the Great Reforms in the mid-19th century, also being defined as a second Russian Enlightenment. But this originated from the humiliating defeat in the Crimean War, which became the impetus for rapid and extensive reforms, as Russia had to modernize quickly. So the reforms that follow were very disruptive, such as even the emancipation of the serfs, which became a revolution on its own by uprooting these former societal structures. Now, conservatism therefore changed further because it became less focused on preventing change and more devoted towards managing it. So in this chaotic environment, it was obviously more political radicalism, rapid industrialization, urbanization, which continued to fuel internal instability as Russia developed. So again, in some ways less conservative, but then also boosting the need for further conservatism to stabilize. And another source of the defeat in Crimea had obviously been the poor infrastructure for transportation. And Russia responded by beginning to develop railways to connect its vast geography. Now, this began to lay the foundation to some extent for a Eurasian political economy of the future. Indeed, by the 1890s, we saw the Russian leadership developing more open ideas about how to capture the Asian market, and essentially the nature of Russia and its path to modernization began to change, especially then under Sergei Witte and Stolpin. Now, by the end of the 19th century, it looked like Russia was just heading to new heights. But then, as we know now, the 20th century was not kind to Russian conservatives, and indeed a problematic century, as the overextension of Russia in the east made it vulnerable to Japan's offensive, and the subsequent loss in the war and following instability led to the 1905 Democratic Revolution, which then also opened up to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And from there on, we see that conservatives really had to develop as exiles. Now, these conservatives began to develop along a Eurasian conservative format. So Russian conservatives, therefore, from the 1920s began to recognize that the Bolshevik Revolution would forever change Russia. So the conservative objective should yet again not be to turn back the clock once the Marxist experiment eventually failed, and thus again purge Russia's own history. Rather, the Soviet Union was conceptualized as a far-left Eurasianism, and once the Marxist experiment eventually failed, it should be transitioned towards more conservative Eurasianism. Now, this new strand of Eurasian conservatism embraced the Mongol era, obviously, as the Mongols had protected the Orthodox Church, and the Eurasianists therefore argued that the Russian identity should also include this Turkic and other non-Slavic elements into the collective identity and consciousness of Russia. So Eurasianists, therefore, like Trubetskoy or Savitsky, linked this identity to an organic Eurasian political economy. So based on the developments of the 19th century, and furthermore, railroads were seen to enable Russia to embrace to some extent the nomadic qualities of former Eurasian powers, be it the Mongols or Huns or Scythians, by being able to engage constructively with these other different civilizations. And this was also a key idea in second generation Eurasianists, be it Gumilev and others, who again also continued to influence Russian conservatism even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, however, Russia did not establish itself as a conservative Eurasian state once communism collapsed. Indeed, as the Soviet Union collapsed itself and some of its eastern territories were lost, Yeltsin seemed to position himself as a second Peter the Great by reinventing Russia solely a European state with these neo-Petrine policies and integrating into, and aiming at least to integrate into this liberal Greater Europe. Now, from a conservative perspective, this can be seen to be a mistake because first, the Russian state had collapsed twice in the 20th century, both in 17 and 91, and there really was a need to restore certain conservative values and historical continuity, of course, after more than 7 decades of communism. So cultural revival, elevate the role of the Orthodox Church in society, and restore traditions. Now, second, it can also be argued to be a mistake, as simply Russia was not welcomed in Europe, which made a mistake to ignore Eastern partners. Now, the idea of a common European home or Greater Europe was largely rejected by the West, which then instead began to pursue European integration through EU and NATO expansionism to unite the continent, with the exception of Russia. So both Yeltsin and thereafter Putin did recognize that they had to look more towards the East. However, in the 90s and 2000s, during the unipolar era, there was not really any other game in town except for the US. However, as we saw, this began then to change, especially in 2014, with the support for the toppling of the Ukrainian government, which became very much a watershed moment, to some extent spelling the death of Greater Europe, and also happening at the same time as China began pushing for a Eurasian political economy and very openly challenging US geoeconomic leadership. So this all very much further pushed Russia in a conservative, well, at least pushed Russian conservatism in a more Eurasian direction in our current century. So the increased alienation from the West also made Russia question both the excesses of liberalism as well as its future within Greater Europe. And the ideas very much reflect ideas from Solzhenitsyn in the 70s, when he had argued against this artificial divide between liberalism and communism, as they both tend to obscure the importance of preserving the tradition and the spiritual. So this is something we also see very much in the speeches of President Putin. And so the conservatism of this century seems to be aimed towards bringing together Russia's 1,000-year history. Now, the 1,000-year time frame makes it easier to absorb a lot of Russia's disruptive periods. So because by expanding and widening the historical memory, the rifts caused by the revolutions become less profound in terms of defining Russia and shaping its identity. So in other words, if the revolutions of 1917 and 1991, well, they should not define Russia, because if Russian history began in 91, it doesn't really have a past and thus not a future either. So these periods has to be included into Russia's identity, but they should not define Russia as the nation was, again, born more than 1,000 years ago. And a key challenge, therefore, is how do you incorporate, for example, the Soviet history? How do you incorporate a revolutionary communist history into a conservative national narrative? So again, you can't set back the clock and purge decades of your own history, yet you can't base your identity on revolutionary communism either, which is very much incompatible with conservative values. So the solution has therefore been to salvage the things you can from this period. So obviously defeating Nazi Germany in the Second World War being a central component, as well as other achievements. But while salvaging parts of the Soviet history, Russia also restored a lot of the Tsarist history and the White Russians who fought against the Bolsheviks. So furthermore, conservatives who died in exile during the Soviet era have been, well, dug up and many reburied in Russia. Statues have been erected in their honor. And the key idea seems to be avoid splitting Russians into good and bad Russians based on the different periods, but rather bring them into the same tent under this conservative idea. Now, admittedly, it must seem very strange to bury Bolsheviks and White Russians next to each other. But again, it's also very strange to see the Kremlin decorated with Orthodox crosses and the Red Star. But again, this is the history that Russia must all include if it's going to have this path forward for organic development and include this, weave it all into one historical narrative. Now, the replacement of Greater Europe with Greater Eurasia is also seemingly becoming a key component of the new conservatism in terms of developing a new political economy. So this is supports the conservative objective of overcoming the obsession with the West, not leaving the West, but merely diversifying and making it less Western-centric without actually leaving Europe. And in the 1920s, you had Eurasianists like Savitsky, who defined Russia's curse effectively being a Eurasian state attempting to develop as a Western maritime power, which led to tensions between Russia and the West, which could be overcome. However, in the present time, again, for the first time in 500 years, there's now an Asian power set to become the leading economic power in the world. So Russia has to adapt to these new realities. And it also presents opportunities, as Russia doesn't need to Westernize to develop, instead overcoming this historical paradigm, and the objective instead seemingly being to reposition itself from this dual periphery of Europe and Asia, and instead establishing itself as a connecting bridge in a larger Eurasian construct. So within this path, obviously seeking a strategic partnership with China is imperative to decouple from, or at least reduce reliance on Western technologies, strategic industries, transportation corridors, financial instruments, and setting up more of a Eurasian geo-economic infrastructure to support organic development. So this resolves to some extent the East-West manifestation of modernity versus tradition. And the political economy is also very much ideal for conservatives, as it doesn't entail purging any previous era. So Russians will still be Europeans, but yet also belonging to the East. So the last point is also this argument that Russia might be establishing itself as an international conservative power, based and attracting soft power based on this new conservative position. Now, this will be interesting, as Russia would then come full circle from the 19th century, when it had a similar role, as a lot of European conservatives did look towards Russia then. However, at the same time, it's important not to, exaggerate the extent of this so far. So as I'm running out of my 20 minutes, just jump to my conclusion here, which is that Russian conservatism has, paradoxically, undergone very much a revolutionary change throughout its history, as the country itself has changed. And the main driving force forward seems to be integrating this fragmented history. So the identity, geography, and the values into somewhat of a collective, conservative national consciousness that can end this divisions pulling Russia in different directions. And on a final note, Russia's conservative Eurasianism also then aims to achieve what Russian conservatives have always attempted, which is to stop obsessing about the West and develop an organic path towards development based on Russia's strength. And yes, I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Glenn. A wonderful presentation and so many good kind of food for thought. There will be, I'm sure, a lot of discussion on the way you frame that kind of long durée analysis, which is really fascinating. Let's now move to our discussion. So I will first give the floor to Andrei Kortunov. Andrei.
Thank you, Marlene. First of all, I'm glad that I have a chance to participate in this discussion, though in no way I can consider myself to be an authority on issues like the Russian conservatism. But I think that as any scholar, I had a chance to read a couple of books on the conservative political philosophy and political thought in Russia, prepared by our domestic scholars, but also by foreign experts. And I think that I liked Glenn's book a lot, primarily because he takes the Russian conservatism seriously. And he tries to analyze it in an honest way. Unfortunately, quite often we see that authors writing about Russian conservatism take a reductionist approach to this notion. They reduce conservatism to a caricature, and then they criticize it with a lot of political bias. In many cases, they do not even see a line between conservatism and extreme right populism, which is clearly something very different from conservatism. What Glenn argues in his book, and I fully agree with him, is that conservatism remains an important organic, natural, and legitimate line in the Russian philosophy and in the Russian political thinking. I do recall the famous book of Alexander Herzen, his book Belloy and Duma, when he wrote about reformers and conservatives, and he recognizes that conservative writers have a lot of merits, and they approach Russia from a different angle. Conservatives treat Russia as a mother, as the mother who has to be loved and protected, while reformers take Russia as a baby, the baby who has to be groomed and educated. So definitely conservatism is organic. Another important point which Glenn makes, and I'd like to also praise him for that, is that you cannot imply that conservatism leads to isolationism. This is wrong. This is wrong in terms of theory, but this is also wrong in terms of actual history. You take, for example, the period of Alexander III, arguably one of the most conservative periods in the 19th century Russian history. At the same time, this period was marked by a very rapid integration of the Russian Empire into the European, Euro-Atlantic maybe, economic and political systems. So it's not accidental that even now in Paris, you can see a magnificent bridge dedicated to Alexander III, although of course his views were very different from the views of the leaders of the French Republic. So in fact, conservatism might mean integration, but of course this is integration on very special terms without dissolving the Russian identity in a broader European one. I think it's important, and I think that that remains a practical issue for Russia of the 21st century. Now, for me, the most important issue is, of course, not the past, but rather the future. And I think that many of us would agree that Russia is approaching the beginning of a new political cycle. Some can even argue that this stage has already started, and Russia is getting to very serious changes. The changes might take a couple of years. The change might be slowed down, but it cannot be reversed. So the big question for all of us is what particular format this change might take. And essentially we have two major ideas about how this change should take place. The first idea is revolutionary. And the idea is that we should get back to 1991 and we should finish the unfinished revolution of early 1990s. It means that we should completely dismantle the institutions which are fundamentally flawed and they are beyond repair. And we should start from the very beginning. And this is something that I would call a revolutionary approach or radical liberal approach, if you wish. The second approach is the approach which implies more gradual, more incremental transition, avoiding the shocks of 1991, avoiding full decomposition and decommission of existing political institutions, but rather gradually developing these institutions in something which can be more functional and more organic. And this is something that can be called a conservative approach. Again, I don't have enough time to describe it in detail, but I think that this is something worth exploring further. So the choice is between a hard landing, which will be the radical liberal choice, and the soft landing, which will be a conservative choice. I think that if we make such a distinction, we should all support the conservative approach, because this approach is likely to be connected to less collateral damage and to a more managed transition in the Russian Federation, which will definitely make Russia safer and the outside world safer as well. So in terms of concluding, let me say that I think that it's a very valuable piece of research. I think that it definitely raises more questions than it offers answers. But I would clearly recommend this book to anyone who is interested in the Russian history and in the history of the Russian political thinking. So we can, I think, congratulate Glenn with his research and his output. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrei, for your comments. Let's move directly to Paul for also giving his feedbacks on the book, and then we will begin collecting questions for the Q&A. Paul.
Okay, thank you, Marlene. And first of all, congratulations to Glenn on the publication of his book on Russian conservatism. Following my own book and Marlene's work, and there's also been a recent collected edition by Mikhail Suslov and Dmitry Ursulana, we're seeing renewed interest in this topic, which I think reflects its importance. And I think it's also quite necessary because, as Andrei has just said, there is quite a lot of exaggeration and I think you might say misinformation about Russian conservatism. It would be very easy to do a hatchet job on the subject. Was no shortage of extremely eccentric Russian conservatives, and you could pick them out and then pick out the most extreme things they said, and then bundle that all up together and write a real bestseller, fascinating story of Russian conservatism. But it would be highly distorted. Unfortunately, this is the approach that some authors have taken. I won't mention any names, but fortunately Glenn has avoided doing this, and I think therefore he's to be congratulated on taking a much more even approach to the topic. Now, his definition of conservatism as a theory devoted to managing organic change is I think quite accurate. At the same time, of course, Glenn I think comes across in the book as you can sort of see the authorial opinion coming through, in that he's clearly quite sort of sympathetic to this approach, and I think those sympathies shine through the book quite clearly. As I see it, he views Russian history as this sort of perpetual repetition of rapid leaps followed by stagnation, followed by another rapid leap, followed by more stagnation, and therefore views conservatism quite positively as a force that attempts to promote a more stable, even progression, which is ultimately more conducive of social harmony. So viewed this way, conservatism is a progressive ideology, not something that seeks to halt development, but rather something that seeks to aid development in a stable manner. And I think that's a fair point of view. Arguably, conservatism is never more important than at times of very rapid change. And you can see this from the Soviet experience, how industrialization and collectivization led to, at least in some respects, a sort of return to conservative values. It's because there needed to be some way of managing the shock and restoring social stability. The idea of organic change, though, does beg the question of of what is organic in a given context. And if we're talking about organic change in a Russian context, we have a problem. Because we have to define the traditions, customs, and history and so on about how to provide the foundations for future development. And that's far from easy precisely because of this process of stop, start, leap and stagnation, which Glenn describes. And Russian history has seen a number of sharp breaks with its past, which have essentially destroyed existing traditions. So how is it possible to, therefore, to talk about organic developments in a country which has never had it, and about which, therefore, there is nothing organic? And in this regard, I was struck by a comment made in a review of my own book in the liberal Russian journal Neprikosnovenny Zapis, in which the journal's editor, Andrei Zakharov, said the following. I'll quote him here. He said, "Conservative ideology in Russia is fruitless. The foundation of any healthy conservatism is always tradition, passed on from present generation to the next, an inheritance that is preserved over the centuries. But in our country, alas, or perhaps fortunately, there is no such tradition, nor can there be. It disappeared long ago, and nothing appeared to replace it." I think that may be taking things a little bit too far, but Zakharov does raise an interesting question here: is how can conservatism flourish when its roots have been repeatedly dug up and thrown away? I think Glenn is absolutely correct to point as contemporary Russian conservatism has been trying to integrate all these different bits of Russian past and put them together. But is that actually really possible? Okay, theoretically, you want to do that, but can it actually be done? And in his books, Glenn somewhat addresses this point when on several occasions he stresses that contemporary Russian conservatism can't jettison the entire heritage of Soviet communism. Pre-revolutionary Russia and post-revolutionary Russia both have to be included within any conservative framework. But that's easier said than done. How is this to be done, given the seemingly irreconcilable nature of these different things? And it would be perhaps interesting to hear further thoughts on this matter about whether this integration, however desirable, is in fact practically possible. Another issue in the book I found interesting was Glenn's discussion of conservative political economy. This seems to be strongly based on the theories of Friedrich List and this idea of the autarky of large spaces. And Glenn sort of views free trade and globalization rather skeptically, it seems to me, as being essentially tools by which dominant economic powers maintain their dominance over weaker states. And Russia, according to this logic, needs to decouple itself from the maritime-based economies and form a continental economy of which it is the center. And this fits in with ideas of Eurasianism. And so Glenn argues that the establishment of what you might call a Eurasian continental economic system would allow Russia to develop in a stable organic future in a way that is not constantly looking west and trying to catch up with the West through these sudden leaps. I think this is an interesting theory, but again, there's a question of practical reality here. There are good reasons, of course, why Russia looks west, not east. Among them is the fact that the great majority of Russians live in European Russia, not in Asia. I mean, the people are there, the infrastructure is there, the links with Europe are there. It's not that easy to reorient the country eastwards into some continental Eurasian economy. For sure, of course, it can be done in part, and due to the rise of China, India, and other Asian states, it's to some degree necessary. But there are possibly limits, I think, to how far this could be pushed. And arguably as well, the Eurasian concept runs up against issues of national identity. However much one might say that a Eurasian future would enable Russia to avoid these problems which come from endlessly trying to become European. But I'm not convinced that most Russians regard themselves as Eurasian. there are, I think, probably some limits on how far you can detach Russia from Europe. I find it interesting, for instance, when I watch, Russian political talk shows on TV, they're always talking about Europe and America, almost never talking about China or India or Central Asia or anywhere else. I mean, the fact is, even while they're, slagging the West off and lambasting it, they're talking about it. But they look West, and I'm not sure that's likely to change. Also, I mean, if we're thinking of a Eurasian political economy, isn't that what Russia experienced under the Soviets, sort of, a continental economic system? And of course, it didn't turn out so well. Whereas we have seen many third world states actually developing very rapidly in the last couple of decades in the era of globalization. Anyway, a final thought is that Glenn finishes his book with a discussion of Russia as an international conservative power. In the talk, he just said that should not be exaggerated, and I think that's correct. Glenn notes that populism arises from a disconnect between liberal cosmopolitan elites and conservative national populations. And where such a divide exists, democratic states are perhaps democratic in name only, as the liberal cosmopolitans who govern the country are utterly unresponsive or even contemptuous of the wishes of those whom they rule. And this opens a space in which can be profitably occupied by those willing to defend traditional values in the nation state. And to the extent that Russia does so, Glenn argues it perhaps has some degree of soft power, which will enable it to win friends abroad. I understand the logic here. I accept Glenn's description of the basic dynamic. I'm perhaps a little bit more, even though he says not to exaggerate it, I'm perhaps a little bit more skeptical about how far this soft power exists. The populist wave, I think, maybe has already peaked in Europe. And we're not seeing a massive reaction to liberalism in Europe or North America. Perhaps I'm isolated from it being in Canada, where we don't seem to have any populism at all. But there we go. Also, populists can be quite anti-Russian, right? So in the United Kingdom, the main populist cause in recent years has been Brexit, but the champions of Brexit, the Conservative Party, are vehemently hostile to Russia. So populism and pro-Russianism doesn't necessarily go together. I think also perhaps efforts to exert Russian soft power can also be used against it, because it's very easy then for sort of liberals and Western states to portray Russia as this dangerous, anti-democratic, anti-liberal bogeyman. I'm also not that convinced that the Russian state is that interested in becoming an international conservative power. I think the Russian state is conservative perhaps in another way, and that's to say interested in stability and realist with a big R in terms of maximizing national interest, and ideology perhaps takes second place. Anyway, I raise those points not to poke holes in Glenn's book. They're simply sort of thoughts which arose as I went along, and I thought might be worth bringing up to provoke some further discussion. And I'd be very interested in hearing his response. And overall, I once again congratulate him on the publishing of this work.
Thank you so much, Paul. Glenn, would you like to take a few minutes to answer some of the comments you received before we open the Q&A?
Sure. Whose question?
I mean, would you like to answer some of Paul's or Andre comments before we open the Q&A? Or do you want me to ask the question, and during the Q&A, you will also answer to Paul and Andre comments?
Yeah, I can. I can work in those answers in the Q&A. That's fine.
Okay, good. So, in fact, there are several questions in the Q&A that are kind of partly overlapping with some of Andre and Paul's comments. So, let me begin with kind of definitional or terminological question. Someone is in the chat is asking you to discuss the notion of an organic development. It's a kind of it's a the notion that societies are kind of organisms is coming from romantic ideology. So maybe societies are not organic, like the metaphor of organicism doesn't work for society. And more broadly, several people in the chat ask you to define if there is one or several conservatisms today in Russia, and if you could name people that you would consider as representative of today's conservatism. And then we will move to kind of gradually more specific questions.
Well, about the organic change, there's usually criticism along whether or not societies can actually be considered organic in terms of being an organism. However, I guess that terminology is ideal to define, but one could also use synonyms such as evolutionary change. But just the basic assumption that societies have to develop based on the past, following a unique trajectory. Now, a key reason behind this is that the present usually gains some stability if it has the legitimacy of the past. This is also why you often find that after revolutions usually followed by great violence if they can't rest on this legitimacy of past institutions. I wouldn't agree that it's misleading. I get the organism aspect, but that is correct. That is a very typical 19th century definition, where the whole idea is that if a civilization effectively outgrows its culture, it's like a plant outgrowing its roots, it will begin to falter. So so that is very much at the center of all conservative ideas, that it has to build on the past. So but for those uncomfortable with organic, one could of course just replace it by evolutionary development. Also then to further contrast it from the concept of revolutionary. So again, this is a very key definition of difference, if you want, between conservatism and the ideological counterparts of liberalism and communism, because on the idea of how human beings or societies evolve, liberalism and communism has more optimism about the ability to effectively modernize by shedding its own past, while conservatives are much more critical about the ability to do so. So again, it's based on it's all based on the basic assumptions from the Enlightenment. So again, I point out that the conservatism also emerged in the Enlightenment, but the basic idea is when societies began to be organized more along reason as opposed to superstition, conservatives recognize these limitations to how much you can change society. That is, it comes with limitations as well as conditions. You can't break with the traditions of the past. So that's where the organic term come from. But again, evolutionary change is just fine as well.
Good. And so on the question of, do you see different conservative trends now in Russia, or is that one unified movement? Is that several conservative competing with each other movement? And could you name some names that you consider really representative?
Well, I guess it's there's always competing definitions of conservatism. So again, conservatism based on some very uniform ideas about the need to manage the group and reproduce it, and the concept of organic change. However, how you define the past is very much defines the different strand of conservatism. So again, through Russian history, you have this from Slavophiles to the Pan-Slavs to the Eurasianists. It really depends on, as Paul Robinson pointed out, exactly what is the group you are reproducing or basing it on. And this is very different. And again, this is also why in the 1920s, the initial Eurasianist movement didn't really go anywhere. A lot of internal divisions. And of course, you have that in contemporary society as well. That is, if you're going to reproduce and modernize the group, you have to first identify what or who the group is to begin with. And I guess that's why you do find a lot of divisions. So again, but it goes back to this idea that the limitations or conditions of change, yes, being a key philosophical feature of conservatism. So the dualism that conservatives attempt to deal with is exactly that they have to address, the tradition, balance it with modernity. You have to position society between rational and instinctive, between individualism and the collective, between spiritual and material, therefore also between continuity and change. But if you don't know what you're continuing, again, also as Professor Robinson pointed out, if you dug up the roots so many times of your own society, exactly what is it that you're continuing? What are you reproducing? And for this reason, you do have different strands, competing ones. I may argue that the Eurasianist approach appears to have more wind in its sails simply because it's the historical development, but also the fact that it has a political economy behind it with this greater Eurasia idea. But also it has it solves a lot of the structural problems, such as bringing together these competing periods of Russian history, as well as ending the obsession with the West. So not necessarily anti-Western, but ending the obsession with mimicking the society. So I think that's the one that will lead the way, even though there are of course divisions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Glenn. There are another set of questions about, so you describe very well in the book the kind of the domestic roots of conservatism in Russia, but what about foreign influence? What about US conservatism being also maybe a model or something some Russian conservative can be interested in reading? So do you see this, do you see any kind of influence of European and today's US conservatism on Russian conservatism as it is framed today?
Well, it depends. American conservatism is somewhat unique because again the country was born in a liberal experiment, in a liberal revolution. So its origins are somewhat different, which clearly defines it. But still, a lot of the key assumptions are the same. This idea that you have to reproduce the group, that this is where the stability lies. So again, one wouldn't get the impression from today, but still, Samuel Huntington, for example, in the 50s wrote that conservatism essentially means you have to put the collective ahead of the individual at times, and so the commonalities is that supporting these structures of the collective, be it the nation, the family, the church, that these are key policies. However, again, the U.S. conservatism has gone through a lot of changes. But one could argue that first the group was imagined in this, through the WASP concept, effectively. But how the conservatives define themselves in the U.S. today, it has very libertarian feel to it. And again, it has a lot of internal contradictions. And I did mention in the book as well when, for example, the economic reforms under Reagan. That he did, well, he picked up on some contradictions. So he argued that, again, in the US, conservatism from its origin suggests that the state should, for example, be small, and arguing very much for market forces to not be constrained. At the same time, he argued, we can't become a country of materialists and let the market, undermine the faith and family and all of this. However, this is where the contradiction lies, because if you're going to let market forces not interfere, the traditional political or ideological goal or mission of conservatives has been to intervene to some extent in the economy to prevent it from ravaging the traditions. I mean, if you go back to Thomas Jefferson, the idea was there should be an agrarian society, not go along the European path of decadent manufacturing society. So I think under Reagan, sorry, back to Reagan, his argument was therefore you can't, we should have a small state, not interfere in the economy. But at the same time, you saw that by having completely free or open markets, it's the market that effectively begins to undermine the family structure, undermines faith, undermines traditional communities. So you can't really have it both ways. And I think that's some of the internal contradictions of conservatism today in the US. So again, it has a very different history and therefore very different strand than Russia. So again, the father of godfather of Russian conservatism, so Sergei Lavrov in 1832, I think he argued that the holy trinity of Russian conservatism was orthodoxy, the autocracy, and the nation. So it's a far leap from the American one, but they both come from the same basic roots. It's only because conservatism rejects universalism, they develop along different organic paths in terms of what they're trying to reproduce. So both Russian and American conservatism has their own contradictions, but different contradictions, that is.
Thank you. And I also invite Andre and Paul if they want to participate in the discussion and also kind of complement Glenn. You're very welcome. Glenn, there is also this question about Russian conservatism being in fact a classical or classic liberalism, a kind of old-fashioned liberalism. In fact, if you read Medvedev of Remizov today, that's something they are arguing, that in fact, the conservatism they are calling for is a form of old-fashioned liberalism, a kind of classical definition of liberalism against Western understanding of liberalism now that they interpret as being a kind of postmodern postmodern liberalism. So I wanted you to address that kind of contradiction, and Paul also mentioned that in his presentation, these kind of ambiguities of terminologies. Like, do you see something like that Russia is in fact, through conservatism, trying to be the old West, again, the kind of postmodern, multicultural West of today?
Yes, so again, that's one of the problems by pigeonholing conservatism too much, because it does come at a specter from resisting all change until the managing change, in which you attempt to accommodate various liberal changes. So again, Putin, for example, is by some conservative, like he defines himself as conservative, but many would dismiss him as liberal, for example, among the more hardcore conservatives. So it does come along a specter. Now, I wouldn't disagree with that characterization, because indeed, when the conservatism that Russia goes for, it does in many ways represent the old liberalism we had in the West. Again, my former boss from HSC in Moscow, Karaganov, he also effectively makes this point often. Like, he also calls for a more conservative vision for Russia, but pointing out that Russia wants the Europe of the 50s and 60s. Again, this was a time in Europe when we kind of balanced the conservatism with liberalism. So again, because there are some contradictions you had in Europe based on the nation states. So a lot of collective institutions defining what Europe is, at the same time using this stable conservative platform for pushing liberalism as a vehicle for human freedoms. Now, the argument often, at least the argument I see coming more often from Russian conservatives as well, is the idea that this is broken down, which is an argument also in the West, that liberalism has begun to decouple from the nation state. So we mentioned multiculturalism or radical secularism, and effectively, the dismantling a lot of the collective institutions, which also Huntington said was necessary for the foundation of a society. So something that defines the group, and I don't think many conservatives see it as not being much of a future in this very neoliberal model, both political and economic model, which they see in Europe. So, but again, it goes back to the Moscovite Russian idea that we're more European than you are now, because you are abandoning Christianity, you are dismantling your own culture, you're not basing society based on the past anymore, which you usually did. We are still doing that, and I guess that goes back to that final chapter about Russia being international conservative power. Now, I said I didn't want to exaggerate that a lot of these movements across Europe, that they're not, they're fueled by domestic internal issues, not much to do with Russia. However, I did put up the picture of Salvini on the slides, because he showed up at the EU Parliament wearing a T-shirt of Putin, so and making the statement that I feel more at home in Russia than I do in Europe. At least they're preserving Europe. So again, it's this idea that Russia is exiled from the continent, but whilst being exiled, is able to preserve the distinctiveness of Europe, which we have thrown away. So it kind of it fits within that same interesting narrative of not Europe and more Europe than you. So I think that's reasonable to say that they therefore emulate some of this liberalism, in the more classical understanding of it.
Thank you.
Marlene, I could just say
yes, please,
one or two words. I mean, I thought you're right, Glenn's right, but I've found it interesting, like even say Russian liberals saying this sort of thing now, with Konstantin Bogomolov's recent article, which could have been written by Dugin, really. So you have essentially liberals making the same arguments as conservatives now in Russia. I've also found it interesting reading some of Lavrov's criticism of Western liberalism. When you actually read his language, what he's accusing them of is not being liberal. So he says liberalism sucks, but he says it sucks because it's not liberal, essentially. But there is, I think, in answer to that question, there does seem to be some congruence.
And I would agree with that, and I think also there's some push towards making, domesticating the Russian liberals a bit, infusing them a bit with more conservative ideas, because I know that's an argument that Professor Robinson made as well before, this idea that the Russian liberals tend to have a bit of a revolutionary flair to them. That is, since the origins from the Decembrist revolts in 1825, they had this dualism to them. On one hand, seek to overthrow or topple the government, and at the same time aligning a bit with foreign powers, and again having a very revolutionary approach to change. I think there would be some indications that even the Russian liberals are moving a little bit perhaps towards a conservative direction, where they seek more evolutionary or gradually change, if you want. We'll see if that prediction pans out. But there have been some recent indications towards that end, though.
Andre, did you want to add on that? Yes.
Well, actually, I wanted to give you my own perception on what might constitute a new wave of Russian conservatism, and how it will be different from the official conservatism that we have right now. I think that we will all agree that conservatism is relative. What looked liberal 100 years ago might look very conservative today. And conservatism of the future will be very different from conservatism of the present time. But in order to be something more than just abstract political theory, conservatism has to have a certain social base. If this social and political base is absent in a country, conservative slogans, whatever you define as conservative slogans, turned out to be nothing more than empty populist statements. And I think that the problem that the Russian leadership has right now is that they want to get back to the definition of conservatism which existed not in the Soviet Union, but rather in the Russian Empire. And the social base for this conservatism is already absent. As an example, let me compare, Putin and Erdogan. Both argue that they take conservative positions on social and political developments in their respective countries. Both emphasize religion, both stand for traditional values, both are statist, and both oppose themselves to the West. However, there is a major difference between Russia and Turkey. You go to Turkey, especially if you go to East Turkey, you'll find relatively large pockets of a rural population, which is very receptive to the Erdogan's definition of Turkish conservatism. These people are ready to get back to their Islamic roots, to get back to the Ottoman history. And in this sense, he has a social base to promote this model of conservatism. You go to Russia and you'll see that Russia is very different from what the Russian Empire was. There is no Russian village anymore. There is no Russian orthodoxy anymore, and the Russians are not more religious than Poles or Irish. They are definitely not more religious than many other European nations. You look at the statistics on divorces, on abortions, and you will find no factual evidence that Russians can get back to the values of the old Russian Empire. So I think that basically this interpretation of conservatism, which is very popular in the official circles of the Russian country, to a large extent is a stillborn. So when I think about what will constitute conservatism in the Russian Federation, let's say in 5, 10, 20 years down the road, I would argue, and I understand that it's a questionable assumption, but I think that this definition of conservatism will be related more to the Soviet Union rather than to the Russian Empire. And it will be about equity, egalitarianism. It will be based on communal values and fight against excessive individualism. But it will be very remote from what is presented today as the official version of the preferred Russian conservatism. So it's hard to tell, of course, how this new version of liberalism will be accepted by the Russian society, but I think that there is a potential for getting back to fairness as the supreme value, not liberty, which is likely to be popular in the world at large and in Russia in particular. And I think that will be something that future conservatives will use more than the traditional, pre-revolutionary version of Russian conservatism.
Yeah, all really, really great points, Andre. Thank you so much. We still have 20 minutes, Glenn, and there are two key questions that are coming that are kind of shifting us from purely political philosophy to kind of more geopolitical international affair concerns. The first one is that there is not a perfect overlap between political philosophy positioning, like conservatism, and geopolitical realities, right? So when you say that the way for Russia to decouple from the West is to move toward this greater Eurasia idea, there are people in the chat asking you to better define the relationship between what is the West and what is Europe. And I think it's also something where I would like to kind of you to disentangle that a little bit more for us, is that you can exit the West by staying in Europe, by promoting the conservative Europe against the decadent liberal West, right? So the political positioning is not necessarily a geographical move from Europe toward Eurasia or Asia. So I would like you to articulate that how the Russian conservative, and you already mentioned that, but that they promote the real Europe against the kind of decadent Western-oriented Europe. But what does that mean in the choice between Europe or Eurasia. I mean, Greater Eurasia is not necessarily the contrary of this conservative Europe. And second question linked to that, and then after we will move to a third one if we still have time, I hope so. Greater Eurasia, what does it mean, knowing that the Russian population doesn't care at all about Central Asia and the Caucasus, even is xenophobic toward that region? So which kind of Eurasia can be a solution for Russia? I mean, is that only the partnership with China, but in that case, without the kind of the Central Asia middle middle region between them? How do you articulate that?
Okay, I'll try to get all of them because a lot of questions. First with the Eurasia, like typically, historically, Eurasia has been defined as a separate entity between Europe and Asia. Greater Eurasia would be somewhat of a different concept because that wouldn't include the entire super continent, so everything, including Europe as well as East Asia. Now, Central Asia obviously playing a role in it, and again, that's a part of the objective of the Eurasian Economic Union as well, using some collective bargaining power similar to what of the EU in order to have greater parity with the EU as well as China. Now, decouple was probably the wrong word if I used that. What I meant to say is diversify, because Russia's not leaving the economic partnership with Europe. The main problem with the economic partnership with Europe has been the asymmetrical interdependence. That is, Russia's been much more dependent on the West than the West is on Russia. And this is problematic because it translates into political as well as cultural influence. So if Russia wants to be less exposed to influences from abroad, it really needs to create more symmetry in relations. And of course, it's not an option to embrace complete autarky. So the alternative is to diversify its ties. So again, can be dependent on the West, but not so much that the West can twist Russia's arms, which is again also what we see in this current struggle with sanctions. That is, the West shouldn't be able to extract political concessions from Russia based on this asymmetrical interdependence. So I think it's so diversifying its economy and connecting more with, for example, China is quite important to this end. But I agree. I think Russia is not. It's leaving not Europe, but leaving the Western ideas to some extent. So this West that, to some examples, constructed after the Cold War. So this, liberal democratic ideals, American-centric. I think not wanting to be a part of this anymore. So that, of course, will have many implications. So I think I also argue, for example, in the book that the format for Europe is already unraveling a little bit, because again, the whole pan-European architecture for cooperation is very much based on the Helsinki Accords from '75. Now, as I point out, this was based on two different ideals. One was sovereign equality, and the second one has been was to introduce human rights into international discourse. Now, the problem is after the Cold War, these two objectives have been contradictory, because if you introduce too much human rights into the West as it is today, it becomes kind of a format for this student-teacher relationship or subject-object between the West and Russia, where the West can interfere too much. So, like my point is therefore that I think you will see, while in the past Russia made excuses for human rights abuses, I think you will see more and more now it's not even going to discuss it anymore. It's not a topic for international discussions. So more or less this continued erosion of the Helsinki European system. So I think that's the Europe that's the West that is rejecting. And I'm not saying there will be some reversed revolution of '89 where Russian conservative values pours into Europe, but the format for cooperation, which has been in place for the past decades, is increasingly rejected as being unacceptable. Which again is why I would differentiate between leaving the West or decoupling from the West and leaving Europe, because as you correctly pointed out, Europe is an important part of Russian history as well, and that's where most Russians live, and they're not going anywhere. So it's it will still be very much European, which again forms part of Eurasia.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. And so let's now move to the last set of questions, which is about Russia's relationship to its near abroad. So kind of two levels question. The first one is that what is the articulation between Russian conservatism and being a great power or an empire? And great power and empire are not the same thing. So how is conservatism necessarily linked to Russia being a great power or to Russia being an empire? And second kind of sub-question, can we imagine a Russian conservatism that wouldn't be dominating over the near abroad, where Russia would be a conservative great power, not feeling the need to pressure its near abroad? So how do you articulate conservatism and Russia's policy in the near abroad? I think that's really interesting questions to try to formulate.
Yeah, no, it is a difficult question, and it's difficult because again, conservatism attempts to reproduce the group, and again, Russia is not a traditional Westphalian state, so it depends what we're referring to. So if, for example, look at the Orthodox Church as a central component for conservatives, the breakup of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, for example, would be problematic, and as I mentioned, the need to salvage parts from the Soviet Union also makes it problematic when countries undermine the legacy or undermine Russian speakers or compatriots. So it doesn't have to be problematic. It could be. Now, I guess great power, it's not necessarily embedded into conservatism. However, if you want to develop as have an evolutionary change, you have to avoid excessive influence from abroad. And but again, this is not even Andrei Kozyrev pointed out, in the 90s that Russia was essentially doomed to be a great power because it would not be incorporated into. It was too big to be incorporated into the West. So then it would have to learn to stand on its own on the outside. So I don't think it's inherently linked towards conservatism, but an empire is interesting. I guess the part of the conservative Eurasianist argument has been that Eurasianism is a way for Russia to do the final transition, because under Peter the Great it was a Slavic empire to some extent, so ruling over other peoples. By including non-Slavic peoples into the concept of us or the group to be reproduced, it's not ruling over other peoples anymore. So it transitions from being an empire to a Eurasian civilizational state. So, but again, part of the concept would be then that Russia would have to, the conservative ideal would be that Russia limits its, makes itself more comfortable within existing borders. And I think to a large extent, I would argue that Russia has begun to. I know Andrei Kurtunov wrote an article that Russia has, the final stages of the Soviet disintegration has begun because Russia's losing a bit interest in a lot of the post-Soviet states. Now, I've argued in the past that I don't think Russia seeks exclusive influence over these regions anymore. I think Central Asia is a good example of it, where Russia is willing to harmonize its interests, for example, with China. But it's very different along its western regions, because in Central Asia, China has shown that it's willing, it has its own interest, and you can reach an agreement and harmonize interests. The problem often with the West is the explicit objectives is to decouple these regions from Russia, so liberate them from Russian influence, if you want. So I think Russia, to some extent, have already abandoned the idea of exclusive influence over these regions. It's again under this concept of spheres of interest, that this is along its borders. Other powers or operating there, are free to do so, but they have to take into account Russian interests. And I think that's sometimes confused with spheres of influence as opposed to spheres of interest. yeah, so.
Yeah, great point. Thank you so much, Glenn. Andre, Paul, would you like to add some elements or go back to Glenn with one really specific final question you would like him to discuss?
I mean, there's just a couple of things that came out. I think on the last question, I mean, there is a trend of Russian conservative thought which is somewhat isolationist. I mean, it goes through Solzhenitsyn, through Simbirsky, and so on, and you can see it in some people like Remizov and so on nowadays, who I think very much reject this idea of empire and want island Russia, which would be, you know, can focus on its own inner development. And I've always thought of this as being somewhat of a very minority point of view, but it's been interesting recently to see Fyodor Lukyanov in a couple of articles in RT, you know, saying how Russia should really just not bother with the West, you know, just the minimum contact possible and so on. And so these ideas of island Russia seem to be gaining a little bit of steam, and that's a very different view to the Eurasianism which Glenn has been putting forward. So I mean, we do have competing visions here, which is what I think makes it very difficult to talk about Russia as a conservative power, because, you know, which conservatism are we talking about? And the other point which came into my brain was when Andre was speaking, he was very right about the lack of social base of conservatism, but liberalism also has a very weak social base in Russia. Historically, it's been never really had any support outside of the intelligentsia, and that's still true today. So we have a society in which no ideology essentially has a strong social base. And maybe that's the way the state likes it. The cynic in me would say, because when there's a void which the state can occupy, right? But it does seem to me that there is that situation which there is no ideology with a strong social base, and that makes it very difficult to predict where things will go in the future, I think. So you know, but I think Andre's right. What we're essentially called left conservatism, you know, we do see that already, and is probably the in terms of social economic conservatism is probably the strongest element, and definitely distinguishes it from American conservatism with its as Glenn was saying, with its liberal you know, free market orientation, and therefore we would push Russia in a rather different direction. So those are the thoughts which came up to me.
If I might, just a couple of words about isolationism. Indeed, I think isolationism as an idea is gaining ground in Russia, and one can argue that this is more or less positive, because Russia drops some of its previous claims on post-Soviet countries, and at least it can put them on a longer leash, if not let them go completely. But what I'm concerned about is that if you take conservatism in international relations in general, conservatism means, first of all, playing by the rules, international law, and it also implies, especially if we're talking about great powers, it implies participation in production of global commons. And when our experts and politicians talk about isolationism, I suspect that quite often they mean that Russia can and probably even should drop some of its international commitments and responsibilities as a great power. And even, you know, President Putin in his last address to the Federal Assembly said that we will not allow the West to cross the red lines. And by the way, we will define where these red lines are. So it's not international public law, it's not international institutions like the United Nations, but it's a decision of the sovereign, in this case of the Russian Federation leadership. So I think that this neo-isolationism, if I might put it in this way, might be misleading. And it might hide an intention to emancipate Russia from the commitments and the responsibilities that it has as a great power. And I think if it is the case, it's still a hypothesis, but if it is the case, I think it's a rather dangerous trend. We should definitely watch it, observe it. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you so much, Andre. Yeah, Glenn, the last minutes for you to conclude.
Well, yeah, I would agree that this conservatism leans, I wouldn't necessarily define it as isolationist, but at least erecting certain borders around Russia, because when this discourse about a greater Eurasian political economy, the focus is always that it's not an EU format where they all integrate into one big GUI, if you want. Instead, it's very specific that yes, there's economic competition, but there's no social political integration. So it will be between distinctive civilizations, between distinctive cultures. So when Russia, on one hand, it seeks key integration with, for example, China, but it still insists on having control over key strategic industries, a sovereign internet. It wants to have its own transportation corridors. It wants to have its own financial institutions. And so effectively having this more self-control, so it doesn't enhance its ability to reproduce its own cultural distinctiveness. But that doesn't mean it can't engage with and connect economically with other regions, only that it can't submit itself to this asymmetrical interdependent relationship which it's had with the West for the past decades.
Well, I think on that's a great way to conclude our discussion. I wanted to thank everybody for participating into the event. Thank Andre, and I think we have one more question coming. Someone is raising hands. Yes, no, no. Sorry. Okay. So wanted to thank Andre and Paul for that great comment, and of course thank and congratulate Glenn for the publication of that book. I think it's really an excellent contribution to the discussion, bringing a lot of nuances and different perspectives in something that, as Andre was saying, is often seen and described in a very caricatural way. So I think with Paul's book and then Glenn's book now, we really have something very, very nuanced and sophisticated approach about, and showing all the complexity and the difficulties of this kind of rise of Russian conservatism in all its possibilities and limits in Russia. So I wanted to thank you all here for attending that event today, and hope to see you all very soon for other discussions we will have on Russia. Thank you again all. And congratulations, Glenn. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.